Hello everyone, welcome to our latest UK Squirrel Accord webinar. Today is both part of National Plant Health Week and the UN's International Plant Health Day, so do get involved. Plants are incredibly important for ecosystems, biodiversity and human life on the planet. However, many are threatened by issues such as rapidly changing environments, pollution, disease and invasive species. And a main focus for the UK Squirrel Accord is the significant tree damage caused by grey squirrels, which are a widespread invasive species in the UK. Through their bark stripping behaviour, they stress, weaken and kill ecologically important trees. And the UK Squirrel Accord currently has a tree damage survey underway, which we piloted last year and are encouraging all woodland owners, managers, volunteers and anyone with landowner permission to take part in this important evidence gathering exercise throughout this year. It helps us build a picture of the damage that's going on around the country, but it also enables us to tell those stories and raise awareness of this because it's a much less well-known issue that the grey squirrels cause. You can find out more on our website at squirrelaccord.uk/tree-damage-survey. Now, that links across to our speakers, as we have Alex Ash presenting some fascinating findings for her PhD into why grey squirrels damage some trees more than others, and Ed talking us through the grey squirrel activity and impact assessment developed by the National Forest and used in our tree damage survey that I just mentioned. I will put a link in the chat to the tree damage survey page, which has some useful links to the methodology, recording sheet and the online survey. And do use the chat for any general discussions or information sharing. But if you want to ask our presenters any questions in the session following their talks, then put them in the Q&A section of Zoom. Excellent. Well, I think you've heard enough from me. So I'll pass over to Alex to find out more about her PhD results.
Okay, thanks, Kay. I'll just share my screen. All right, can you see that?
I think it's just coming up. Yes, that's great.
Yep, okay, perfect. Okay, yeah, thanks, Kay, for having me speak about my PhD. So I did my PhD at the University of Southampton and I just finished last year. So I'll be talking to you about some of my results, but I currently work at Forest Research and the University of Southampton, and I still do work on bark stripping behavior. So if you have any questions about our current work, you're welcome to ask those. And some of the slides will have a little picture of a camera with a symbol on top. For those slides, please just don't share because we're still writing up the results from those. So to start, I'll talk about the problem and then also so why squirrels are damaging to our forests and trees, and also how we manage it currently, and then the aim of my project and how we will hopefully make that a bit better. So I'll go on to talk about some the differences in volatile compositions between trees that vary in their susceptibility to damage. And then I'll go on to talk about some of the behavioral responses that we recorded from squirrels in response to some of those compounds that we identified. And then lastly, some conclusions from the work as well. So most of you probably know a bit about red squirrels and grey squirrels in Britain, but if you don't, that's fine. And so grey squirrels were introduced to the UK in the late 1800s, and they were introduced as sort of cute additions to our parks and gardens. But when they were introduced, they also brought with them the smallpox virus, and so they introduced a lot of disease to our native red squirrel species. And through this disease, but also through competition with resources and food, they were also able to outcompete red squirrels from much of mainland Britain. But they also cause a lot of damage to our forests through their bark stripping behavior, which I'll talk about a bit more in the next slides. And they also have some other negative biodiversity impacts, such as predating on eggs and songbird chicks as well. And they also probably have positive biodiversity impacts to some extent, but a lot of those other negative biodiversity impacts, especially due to their bark stripping behavior, we don't fully understand. So I'll show you some pictures of what damage looks like. So Picture on the left and top right are some fresh damage of beech trees that I took pictures of a couple of years ago. So this is quite characteristic of what you see when a beech tree is damaged. What squirrels do is they peel the outer bark off of the tree and then scrape their teeth or lick the inner bark layer or phloem. And so we know that they're after that inner bark layer because they discard the outer bark. In the top right picture, you can see all of the outer bark chips at the base of the tree. But we don't really fully understand why they're going after the inner bark, but there's something in there that they want or that they're feeding on. So the picture in the middle is you also see quite often with bark stripping damage. So squirrels will quite often damage the re-damage old wounds on trees, and they will typically go for the calluses of those wounds as well. And that's probably because the tree's putting in a lot of effort to grow the bark back over the wound and heal itself. So there's probably a lot of good stuff in that part of the tree as a result. And then the bottom right picture is a picture of a tree that's been felled and what historic damage of the tree looks like inside the tree. And so you can see a lot of wounds there that have healed over. And this is quite it's tough. It's difficult with squirrel damage because a lot of the time, if they've had historic damage and healed over, you don't tend to see that on the outside of the tree because it's hidden, and you don't see it until the tree has already been felled. So squirrel damage is quite a well-known issue amongst the forestry community. It's been named the #1 threat to broadleaf woodland health and creation by the Royal Forestry Society, and that's alongside other threats such as deer damage and other introduced pests and diseases as well. And a report published in 2021 estimated the costs of squirrel damage to Britain, and it estimated that to be up to £37 million a year. And that includes things like managing squirrels and the cost of controlling them, but also the loss in timber profits, and also trees that have died as a result of squirrel damage, and the loss of their carbon sequestration potential as well. So it has really, really big impacts on our forests and trees. And the only methods that we have currently to manage squirrels are lethal methods, which can be really effective sometimes, but they have to be applied at quite large scales and quite a lot of effort. And you have to be it has to be applied in a coordinated approach so that you can get most, if not all, of the squirrels. Um, and that's important because we still don't really understand why squirrels bark strip. And so we have to put a lot of effort into these methods to manage them to make sure that they are effective. But squirrel damage also undermines a lot of our woodland creation initiatives, and we're planting a lot of trees in this country to combat climate change and biodiversity loss. So it's a really big problem. And the aim of my PhD was to test the potential for deploying the natural defenses of trees, so compounds that trees produce, to manage bark stripping damage. So the first thing that I looked at was describing the composition of volatile organic compounds. I'll explain that in a second. In trees that vary in their susceptibility to squirrel damage. So we know that squirrels use smell and taste to make foraging decisions, as many animals do. So we thought, how could we exploit that to understand a bit more about the behavior and also develop some potential ways to manage the behavior. And previously we have looked at tree chemistry in relation to bark stripping damage, but a lot of that work was inconclusive. So we have looked at things like sugars, minerals, and amino acids, and those things probably do have an influence on probably do influence how squirrels make decisions to bark strip a certain tree over another, but we don't really know. And currently we haven't explored the role of terpenes. So terpenes are odorous compounds that plants produce, so things that squirrels would smell. And a lot of the time, these compounds can be defensive chemicals that trees produce in response to mechanical damage. And we know that these types of compounds have demonstrated an influence on herbivory in grey squirrels, but other squirrel species as well. So we know that these types of compounds can affect their foraging decisions. So I focus specifically on volatile organic compounds, um, and these compounds are gaseous compounds that are produced by plants. Again, things that squirrels would smell. And previously, rodent pest management, or currently rodent pest management globally, is still really heavily reliant on rodenticides, and we don't use rodenticides to manage squirrels in this country anymore, but we used to. But a lot of the scientific literature is calling for a shift towards using other methods that are more ethical and environmentally friendly, such as these compounds that I've mentioned. Um, and yeah, so we know that these compounds have influenced the herbivory of other squirrel species. So we're thinking, how is there a possibility that these compounds could be that squirrels could be using these as a scent cue to indicate the palatability of trees? So how are they making decisions on whether one tree is more palatable than the other? And there's a really strong potential to exploit these compounds for future mitigation strategies, and they could be deployed at really large scales to deter squirrels from whole areas of woodland. And a lot of other studies have done this with other rodent species in crop fields. So there's a potential that this could work as well for squirrels. So we have identified a provenance trial plot where a lot of the trees in the plot get damaged quite badly by squirrels, but there's one species in particular that doesn't get damaged at all, really. And so provenance trials are tree experiments that plant various hybrids or clones of trees from different places to see how well they grow in a particular environment. So this particular plot was a provenance trial of poplar hybrids. And so each of these plots were clones of a hybrid. So a hybrid is a mix between two different species, but they're all within the same genus, the poplar genus. And so there are 11 clones on this plot, and there's one in particular that actually gets no damage. And so that's the picture in the middle. And those trees are quite tall and straight, but our other trees on the plot that get damaged a lot um, are quite deformed and almost like flattened at the top. So the squirrels were ring barking the tops of the trees, and then the tops would either would a lot of the time break off in heavy wind and bad weather. And you can see a lot of those tops on the ground there, actually, in the picture on the left. So these are all the trees that we have to study. And I went and recorded damage scores for all of these trees. And for the rest of this presentation, mostly the yellow colors will indicate resistance or resilience to bark stripping, and the purple or darker colors will indicate susceptibility. So there's quite a nice relationship between the genetic history of the trees, each of the clones on the bottom, and how susceptible they are to squirrel damage. So the tree on the far right are robusta trees. They don't get damaged a lot, really. So a lot of those trees have no damage. And then on the far left, we've got our most susceptible species, which does see a lot of damage, and most of those trees had been ring barked. So I went to this plot and collected leaf foliage from the trees, and then placed them in gas chambers to collect the volatiles that were being emitted by these plants. And then I made extracts from those volatiles, and then we ran that on gas chromatography mass spectrometry, and were able to identify a lot of the main chemical components within each of those clones. So there's a lot going on here, but I'll take you through it. So the plot on the left just looks at qualitative differences in volatiles. So that's just presence and absence of certain compounds within those trees. So how does the presence and absence of compounds vary between those trees, and how does that relate to susceptibility? So that yellow shape is a grouping of all of the trees that either don't get damaged or have a little bit of damage. And they're grouped quite closely. And then we've got the purple shape, which is a lot of our trees that get damaged quite severely, and they're all grouped together. So we see distinct compositions in our trees that don't get damaged versus ones that do get damaged. And then the plot on the right. So for both of these plots, actually, the closer 2 points are, the more similar their compositions are, and the further apart they are, the more dissimilar they are. So on this plot on the right, we've got all of our highly susceptible species grouped in the bottom right, and then our main resistant tree is grouped in the top left of that plot. So this plot looks at quantitative differences. So how does the abundance of these compounds differ between the species, not just the presence and absence? So from these two plots, it does look like these different clones have very distinct volatile profiles and chemical profiles. So you're probably asking, well, what are these chemicals and how do they differ? So these plots correspond to this plot on the right. And so each of the squares in each of these plots correspond to a square on the previous plot. So if you look at caryophyllene and DMNT, you've got paler squares on the top left, and that means that compound's more abundant within those squares. And that's where we find our robusta tree. So those compounds are more abundant in our resistant species. And then if we look to the right, where we've got ocimene, farnesene, and cubene, we've got those compounds more abundant within the bottom right of the plots, which is where we find most of our susceptible species. So then if we combine all of these compounds within with their damage scores, we get a plot like this. So this is a Sankey diagram, and it essentially shows the flow of information from left to right. So each of the rectangles is a node. And if we go to the far right, we've got damage score, which is ordered from higher damage to low damage. And then in the middle, we've got all of our clone types, which are ordered from most susceptible to least susceptible. And then on the far left, we've got all of our compounds ordered from their abundance within each of those clone types. So what this plot shows is that we've got, for example, farnesene is very abundant within all of our susceptible species, but less abundant within our resistant species. And then if we look at the bottom, we've got very small abundances of those compounds, but they typically are only present within our resistant trees. And that basically shows that a lot of these compounds, even though because they are lower in abundance, and they typically are only present within our resistant species, but they're probably quite costly to make, but they're also worth the cost because of the protection that they give those species. So to summarize this part of the project, we found observable differences in volatile chemistry between clone types, and the volatile content varied qualitatively, so in presence and absence for those compounds, and quantitatively, so in abundance also. And the volatile composition was associated with tree susceptibility, so this hints at a possible causal relationship of these volatiles in the natural defense mechanisms against herbivory. So now I'll move on to the second part of the project, which using some of the compounds that I identified in the first part, we tested the effects of these on squirrel behavior. So using these compounds, we identified a set of compounds from our resistant tree and also a set of compounds from our susceptible trees. And we exposed wild squirrels to these compounds and then recorded their behavioral responses relative to a control and compared their responses to chemicals from susceptible trees, but also to a control. So we had feeding hoppers with a small vial, a glass vial with mineral oil and the compound mixed in with a cotton wool plug. And that was placed inside the feeder. And when the squirrels opened the feeder, they were able to get a waft of that odor, essentially. And then for the control, it was just mineral oil, so it wouldn't have any scent to it. And then for each of these hoppers, we had a camera on, a camera face towards the hopper so that we could record their behavioral responses. So I don't know if this will play. But here's a video, an example of a video that was at one of our hoppers. And so it was just, I spent a lot of time watching these videos, extracting behavioral data. And it was hard to see at this time what the differences would be. But when I analyzed the data, it was quite apparent that where we had a lot of these um, potential repellents that we identified from our resistant trees, that the squirrels, once the squirrels were exposed to them, they spent less time feeding, less time at the hoppers, and less time with the lid open compared to a control. And there were some exceptions to that, but broadly, that's what we found. And it was kind of the same for attractants, where on average, squirrels spent more time feeding, more time at the hoppers, and more time with the lid open relative to a control. So in conclusion, we essentially found negative behavioral responses to, or generally found negative behavioral responses to DMNT, Desmond campine, which were compounds that we identified from our resistant tree, and generally positive behavioral responses to acetophenone and osmine and farnesene, which were compounds we identified from our susceptible trees. And so these volatiles do appear to mediate squirrel behavior. So to summarize, our resistant and susceptible clones emit distinct volatile blends, and those compounds have were recorded to also influence squirrel behavior directly in our behavioral experiments. So in the short term, how we can use these results is to develop chemical applications like sprays and paints that you can apply directly on trees, and that would be similar to how we apply tricho. This would really only work if we're aiming to protect individual trees, because applying it at a whole, at the scale of a whole woodland would probably be too expensive. But in the short term, you could potentially protect individual trees using those methods. But in the longer term, we would want to look into gene editing technology to breed trees resistant to squirrel damage. So once we identify a genetic trait that is responsible for the expression of these compounds or producing these compounds, then we can breed those genes into trees that we want to plant that are typically susceptible. And then once they've been bred that way, then we can plant them out and hopefully they're resistant to squirrel damage. But that will take a very, very long time to do that. So it's quite a far away solution. So what we need to do next is translate these results into practice and see how they practically would work in management. But squirrel damage and grey squirrels in general still remain a really complex wildlife management challenge because we don't really have a perfect solution for managing them yet. But also we have a lot of conflicting management objectives between stakeholders and between landowners too. And that remains a problem because until we agree on some consensus for management, it won't be as effective in managing squirrels. And then lastly, we still don't fully understand why squirrels bark strip. And we need to know that because we can develop more targeted methods to manage the behavior. So for example, if they're bark stripping to self-medicate from a parasitic infection, which some animals do, then we could deploy medicine to squirrels in the wild. And understanding why they bark strip would really help target our methods to managing them. So yeah, thank you so much for listening, and thanks to everyone that was involved and supported me in my project.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Alex. I mean, yes, the question of why squirrels bark strip, why they attack certain trees more than others, it has a huge question mark over it for years. But I mean, this certainly does get us far closer to far better understanding of what they're doing and why they're doing it, and hopefully will offer some solutions for the future. Definitely. Thank you. Excellent. So now we will pass over to Ed to take us through the methodology. And a bit about the National Forest, I imagine.
Course. Hopefully that's coming up for everyone.
Yeah, it looks great. Thank you.
Perfect. Yes, thanks for coming along today, everyone who's here. So my role for the National Forest is Woodland Manager, and I'm going to just talk through the National Forest Grey Squirrel Activity and Impact Assessment. But before we go into that, I will just quickly briefly mention the National Forest. For those that are unaware, the National Forest is a 200 square mile area of the Midlands, situated, as you can see on your screens there, with four main urban towns of Ashby, Burton, Swadlincote and Colville. Project is now, of the National Forest now been going for over 30 years, and in 1991 the 200 square mile area has as little as 6% forest cover, identified here by the green polygons on screen. And as of this year, we have now reached our 10 millionth tree, and that forest cover is now over 25%. So you can see there that change in those 30 years means we've planted lots of trees, 10 million of them, and lots of woodlands. Of those woodlands, around 90% of our trees are broadleaf, and that gives us a specific vulnerability to grey squirrels. As was mentioned in the first presentation, if the damages caused by grey squirrels are excessive across young broadleaf plantations, so we have developed this methodology over the years through predecessors and now through ourselves, pushing it through the grant systems to really highlight where grey squirrel damage is occurring and what the level that damage is occurring at. Okay, so first of all, why are we going to monitor squirrels? Well, I've just mentioned it there a little bit, but in particular, early recognition of issues within your woodland is always important. And many landowners, like we have here in the National Forest or elsewhere, are not always from a forestry or similar background. And as such, they don't necessarily have that knowledge of what a squirrel impact might look like and what those squirrel impacts might lead on to in the long term. And not being able to recognise that issue can sometimes mean the damage has gone too far for that particular age class before management interventions can lower that and lessen that damage impact on site. So therefore, monitoring squirrels is very important for every woodland owner or manager to be able to undertake and to meet their site objectives for the long term. So how can we monitor squirrels then? Well, we could count squirrels, but this, as I'm sure most of you will know, it would be very difficult considering how squirrels do tend to look very similar, and if they're overlapping ranges, as you're walking through the woodlands, you might be spotting the same squirrel several times. So the survey does not ask you to count the number of squirrels. There are clever systems that can monitor squirrel populations by monitoring squirrels with camera traps, but that's not really going to be accessible to every single small, large, medium woodland owner with the amount of equipment and analytical time that will be needed to do so. So again, we aren't looking to count the squirrels with this. Instead, what we can do is monitor the impact that squirrels have as a bit of a proxy for a population. This can also potentially be more directly relevant when we're thinking about woodland management, and monitoring can then form part of an annual woodland health check, a bit of a walk around your woodland, taking it in what you've got. And as we're in Plant Health Week, that seems very pertinent today. This means the data can be then collected regularly and fits in with your other commitments as a landowner or as a woodland manager. And that regular recording hopefully will result in more data and a better understanding of what's happening over time and those changes to impacts that you can see in your woodland. So that's the basis of where the grey squirrel impacts assessment came about. It was originally a master's project by a former employee of the National Forest Company, and then it's been sort of developed and tweaked over the years. So the version you're looking for in 2026 is the autumn 2025 update, and I'll go into what the updates are there. This should be available on the UK Squirrel Club website that Kay's sent a link into there. It's also available on the National Forest website, and it should be available as well by Countryside Stewardship. So the method is looking for impact through tree damage, activity through drays, and feeding sites as well for activity. Okay, so the next few slides will go through how it works, and then we'll look at actually damage and damage scoring in itself. So first of all, we are looking for both fresh squirrel damage and cumulative squirrel damage. So cumulative squirrel damage was removed from the survey a few years ago. Last year, as of last year's update, has been put back into the survey. That's why it's in bold on your screen there for anyone that's had the 2022 or 2023 version of the survey method. We do now want to see cumulative damage being brought back in. The easiest time to undertake the survey is when leaf cover has not yet reached its peak. So we're looking maybe around now still as most canopies are starting to flush fully into their summer leaf, but also into the autumn then as a leaf drop occurs and into the winter. Now fresh damage will look very different from now through the summer and then into the autumn and winter. So what you can see here on the screen is really good contrast between fresh damage and some historic damage there, and you can see that change in colour. So there's fresh damage on screen. We've got these discarded pieces of bark at the base. We've got this very ragged edge, perfect sort of squirrel pattern of damage there, and this colour, the exposed underlayers there, have yet to be weathered, and that contrast next to it is a weathered piece of bark there. And as was mentioned, these trees will likely try to occlude these wounds over time, so these might shrink as well. So it's likely what we're looking at here is very fresh damage in the pink, and in that grey-black colour, we've got maybe damage that's up to 18 months, 2 years, around that ballpark figure. The one thing to mention here with timing is it's important to, whatever time of year you choose, try and maintain it as a consistent time of year to do your survey, whether that's an annual survey or whether that's a more phased survey across several years. Keeping the time of year consistent will mean that as over time, especially if you're surveying multiple woodlands, this knowledge of what fresh and older damage looks like, you'll be able to see that more quickly, but also the damage at trees that you're monitoring for damage are roughly the same trees each year, so therefore you can monitor the change there and what's occurred in that 12-month period from when the last time you came, so you can really put sort of a marker on it each year. Okay, so the next thing to consider then after timing is how you will undertake the survey, and this involves planning routes across the survey sites. This survey typically is a transect survey, so what we're looking for here is a stop every 100 metres, with 1 stop per hectare. So this example on the screen is an 11 hectare woodland with 11 stops for the survey. However, for any woodland smaller than 3 hectares, you should always have a minimum of 3 stops. This helps to give a minimum amount of data collected, but also helps with the data analysis that we'll come on to later on. Where possible, the route should always avoid open ground and the ride network to really take a random sample across the site. If a line transect is not possible, then you can do a more randomised grid approach where you put 1 stop per hectare across a grid of the woodland. And if you've got a very large woodland or distinct planting compartments, then you might want to split into multiple transects or multiple surveys days as well. This is all individual decisions. These are individual decisions. So if you say you have 100 hectares, it's very realistic that you're going to survey that all in one day. You might split that into 3-4 days, but if you want to keep the survey at the same time of year, then try and keep those days as close together as possible. If you have a specific broadleaf dominated woodland, but within that you have a specific coniferous compartment, then the damage levels in the conifer blocks are likely to be lower. So you could choose to exclude that and survey it in a separate survey and survey your broadleaf doing a different one. Both can be relevant. You can keep it in or you can take it out. Again, you just need to understand how that might influence your results going forwards. Okay, so we've got the when and we've got the where. The equipment you need to survey is very little in terms of mandatory equipment. We have the PDF document for methodology. You can print that out, or you can have that on your phone or tablet. And we have an Excel spreadsheet. Again, within the Excel spreadsheet, there's a print sheet there for data recording. So you can print that out and take that into the woods with you. If you do have a tablet or access to a tablet, then you can take that data recording sheet out into the woods, and that saves you typing it up when you get back to the desk. So a tablet can be very useful for recording the data. A GPS or a phone could really help replicate where the stops are within your woodland. So we mentioned earlier about stops. So that example on screen is 11 stops because it's 11 hectare woodland. So to find those 11 stops year after year, putting a what-free words or a GPS location to navigate to can be a really useful exercise. I've seen people use ribbon or spray paint on the trees, obviously if you have the landowner's permission or if you are the landowner. And then the final piece of equipment is binoculars. So if you're taking out binoculars, that will obviously help you see with greater detail into the canopy as we look to the top of the trees, especially as your trees mature, or if you do have a fairly mature woodland on this first point. Again, with these, and in particular with the binoculars, if you're going to use them for the first year, then try to use them for every year to keep that same equipment and that same repeatability of the survey. Okay, so first of all, then we're looking for activity indicators. So activity and impact, so we're going to focus on activity to start with, and feeding sites. Now, feeding sites, as seen on screen here from this picture, could be acorns, pine cones, hazelnuts, nuts that maybe have been broken into rather than chewed, pine cones that look something like this. The number of these that you can spot at each stop is likely to be very low. And sometimes the practicality of walking a 30-metre radiuses from your central point to try and find these can be quite difficult, especially if you've got a site that's of undulating ground or has a high level of bramble or natural regeneration or scrubby growth, whatever it may be. You might struggle to get out in each direction at 30 metres. If you can see a rough sample within the woodland, within your stock within the woodland, of how the feeding sites are, then that can still be a useful indicator to maybe monitor where squirrels are active. You then might be able to focus your efforts to control any populations that you need to control following the survey. So similarly with feeding sites, drays again. So drays we're looking for 30-metre radiuses from your stop point, from your standing point in 30 metres. Now these can be slightly easier to spot because you don't have to walk 30 metres as such. Obviously you can look for drays within branches and within the canopies. Only record these if you're sure. So again, if you're unsure what drays look like, something like on screen there, so quite spherical and dense balls of leaves, very woven in. They're likely to be squirrel drays. But again, the more you get your eye in for it, the quicker these parts of the survey can become. And both these activity monitoring indicators are not designed to influence your impact score, but instead how you might go about managing your woodland and targeting different compartments or specific areas of the site for that future management. Okay. So before we get into impact monitoring, just wanted to quickly do one slide on squirrel versus deer bark stripping, sorry, not deer barking. So we have deer all across the country. Deer are also a huge impact of woodland. And anything sort of below that 1.8 metres can typically be, anything above, sorry, that 1.8 metres can typically be classified as squirrel damage in the across the majority of the country. Anything below that 1.8 meters, we perhaps do need to look at it, and that will vary again on what deer you have on site as well. Because again, that height could decrease with depending if you've only got sort of smaller species like muntjac. But deer in general will strip bark, and they will also damage trees through antler damage like this, through scoring. So there are visual guides from the Forestry Commission, so I'm not going to go into a complete sort of detail here, but again, start to learn what different herbivore damage looks like. So the other thing you might have on site is you could have hare or rabbit damage potentially on some, especially on some of the younger trees. So do look out for that as well. But deer and squirrel damage, you can start to see the differences, and once you can see that difference, it does become quite apparent once you're observing this here being deer damage. That will come on to what squirrel damage looks like, but squirrel damage does tend to be far neater and more uniform across the damaged area. Okay, so recording impact indicators then. So at each of the stops, at each of your stops on your survey route, we are going to identify the 5 closest trees. Now these are five closest trees with a diameter of breast height, a DBH of greater than 7 centimetres. Now this we put into the method to try and account for sites where we have a great varied age structure and structure across the woodland, but what we don't want to do is for people to get confused or to start counting tiny little whips that are very unlikely to have reached a damage age, and ignore perhaps something that's in mid-rotation or young mature age that is within the damage range still, that's directly next to it. So we're taking the 5 closest trees, and as I said earlier, if you are going to, or if you do have permission to, you might want to mark these trees for future years so that you know exactly which trees you are monitoring, because you'll monitor these trees on each subsequent survey. So within the recording sheet, you've got your 5 trees listed 1 to 5, and then you'll list the species. Again, we're not looking for everyone here to know the exact species. If you know it's an oak but aren't sure exactly what type of oak or birch, or going down into specifics, then that's fine. If you're really struggling, then it might be a good opportunity to learn some more typical trees within your woodland. Again, it can be a real point for landowners to start to learn what's going on, what issues might be on site. Once you've got your tree species, the next columns that we'll come on to, and I'll show you the data sheet in a second, will be the location of damage. So this has been split into 3 areas: the basal damage, mid-stem, and crown. Through each of these, we're taking each tree on its own, and we're doing a full 360, starting at the bottom and working our way all the way to the crown. So once you've got the location of damage, we are then, if you find any damage, you're then looking, okay, is it fresh or is this historic? So fresh damage, depending on the time of year, will have a different colour and different edge to it. You might find some discarded bark at the bottom or hung up in different side branches of the tree. Cumulative damage is any historic damage, but then also as you go through the years, that fresh damage will obviously shift to cumulative damage actually after the first year. So the idea behind the cumulative damage being there is that it will identify that historic base damage level that you've got. But hopefully what the focus of the impact should be is that you should see that fresh damage coming down over time. As if that fresh damage is high enough, or hopefully if it's there, you've got any fresh damage at all, you're really putting efforts in to controlling your squirrel populations and eliminating as much of that fresh damage as possible, and therefore that cumulative damage should hopefully plateau as well. Okay, so we're scoring the damage on the 0 to 5 scale. I'll come on to that in a couple of slides time so we can go into that detail. So this is the data collection sheet. So this is in the Excel workbook for those using the Excel workbook. You can see here we've got stop number, we've got our what3 words or GPS location, we've then got our tree number, tree species, the location of damage. So this can be in multiple places. And then we've got our fresh damage score and our cumulative damage score. So filling all of that out, this is available as a print sheet as that. So this will be an A4 printout you can have, or unlimited number of stops to the data inputs. Then we've got our activity scores, and as I say, these don't feed into any data analysis, but they give you a nice average over the site and use specific areas of where what hectare might have more activity through these indicators. And then we have a comments column. So this comments column could be used for anything really. Again, it doesn't feed into the data side of things, but it can be a real useful tool for a manager or a landowner to state whether they've got issues with antisocial behaviour or whether they've got ash dieback or a new disease that they're concerned of in a certain compartment, whether they feel like the woodland management plan in that certain compartment needs tweaking, for example. So it's just a note to be had. Okay, so fresh damage score. So we are, as I say, we're on a 0 to 5 scale. So these images here are all fresh damage, and they're all quite new fresh damage. So you can see the colour of the trees here as well. So 0 is no fresh damage, and then working our way up from 1 to 5. So at 1 we have coin or a nail-sized exploratory bark area has been stripped. You can see here this field maple got this quite nice, well, not nice, shouldn't be saying it, but it's got this creamy colour to it. This is low down. This is underneath. This is below sort of ½ metre in height, basal damage, and we can see it's just a test patch. So it's just a little test patch. Which is the only damage on that tree at that point in time, but it's likely that squirrels may come back. So whilst they can be hard to spot, they are very important to get noted down, and then obviously to monitor any damage that occurs from there. Moving up to a 2, so we're now looking at a hand-sized piece of bark being stripped. So this is an oak. For those that wouldn't be able to see, again, at different times of year, it looks different. So this is an oak tree. You see, we've got this hand piece, mid-stem piece of bark removed. Onto a 3, this damage now has the potential for less than 50% of the canopy to die. So this is progressing from a hand-sized piece, and it's likely that it could have an impact on the canopy, but nothing that you would expect it to cause a total or partially total death of the canopy. Onto a 4, this damage then has the potential for greater than 50% of the canopy to die. So this number 4 image on screen, if you might be able to see, it might not be big enough, but this tree here is an oak again, unfortunately, and it's a forked stem. So it's forked about 1.5 to 2 meters up. And then what we've got is one of the stems has been completely stripped in the round from that point all the way up to the top in one season. So that's all fresh damage there. Now, obviously, we still have that left-hand side stem, which does have its bark intact and for now can remain. So we have at least 50%, but there were a few small patches on that other stem. And then onto a 5, this is the sycamore. Again, you may not be able to see, but on the actual image of this, it's almost stripped like a banana. It's peeled that quickly, and that can be different, obviously, for species as well. So sycamore does, with that age in particular, does strip off in quite large chunks. Same with willow and those sort of more vigorous sort of growing species with that looser bark levels. Okay, so that's the 0 to 5 of fresh damage. So you can see all that there. Then these are not ideal images because we don't want to see this at all, but these are images that you may not come across. It might not be as obvious to spot as this. You might be, and hopefully you're more likely to find 1s and 2s than you are likely to find 4s and 5s for fresh damage. 4s and 5s for fresh damage are very concerning over the time. Okay, so then cumulative damage. So this is where we're looking at the fresh and historic combined. Okay, so what we've got here then is, I haven't got a picture of a C1 here, but remember an F1, so fresh one is a coin sized area, and pretty much as soon as they start adding up, it will almost get to a C2. So here we have cumulative areas of bark stripped and to result in hand sized. So what we can see here is we've got this business card, sort of standard business card. So we've got one area, fresh damage on this beach, basal damage again, and then around it, these are these little knuckles of damage where occluded damage has the historic damage has started to occlude and recover, so to speak. And then moving on again, we've got some willow here with fresh damage, discarded bark, but you can see on this forked stem again, we've got the historic patches around the back. So we've now sort of progressed beyond that it's a hand-sized piece in total, and we've now got a C3. C4, so here we've got a forked stem again, quite handy for when you're talking about 50%, but lots of fresh damage, but also this historic damage on the right-hand stem, So we are now looking at damage that's above 50% to to kill more than 50% of the canopy. And then the C5, here again we've got forked birch. Slightly, this forking might have happened when the original historic damage happened. This was the birch's response to try and put on this new leader. What you can see is the original leader, or the right-hand side stem on your screen, has historic damage. It's black in colour, it's been dead for a number of years now. And then this left-hand side stem or new leader has now been stripped all in 1 year. So now that total canopy has died, has been stripped in its entirety. So that's now a C5. So back to the recording sheet. So this is what a rough pre-start woodland might look like, with your numbers and locations there and species. So again, if you've taken the paper sheet out, you'll be typing these back into the recording sheet. This will then all auto-populate. So you see at the bottom of this screen, we've got the tabs. There's an instructions tab, there's a summary sheet, there's the print sheet I was mentioning earlier that you take out into the woods. Then there's data input that you put the data into if you've got a tablet or if you've taken typing it back up. And then that will feed into the Do Not Edit tab, and that feeds back into the summary tab to give you a nice, concise summary of numbers, which looks something like this. So here we have the boxes in green are to be populated by yourself. So we have your woodland name, your grid reference, the date, surveyor's initials, and then the number of stops surveyed. So you have to input the number of stops surveyed, otherwise the results won't populate in the blue boxes. You can tick whether you use transect or non-transect, and then these blue boxes will auto-populate from the data you've inputted. So what we have here is we have fresh damage, and then the average per stop. We have cumulative damage and the average per stop, and drays and feeding sites in the same manner. Now, as I say, drays and feeding sites are a good idea of what's going on in your woodland. For the damage, we are looking for a score of 3 or below, that the damage is low enough that it's not yet having a significant impact on the trees, and 5 or above, damage is having a significant impact on the woodland, and the woodland will be declining in health and tree form. So you can see here that historically we've got a real issue, but the fresh damage is right on that cusp. So what we're looking at here then is, okay, we still need to bring that fresh damage down. So in summary, and to give some time for questions, the survey involves 1 stop per hectare of woodland to give a representative sample of the 5 closest trees monitored for damage and the surrounding 30 metres for activity per stop. A minimum of 3 stops is required for any woodland, even for woodland less than 3 hectares in size. The results should be recorded on the survey sheet I've been showing today, and also hopefully put through the UK Squirrel called Tree Damage Survey, which is on the link in the chat. And this ensures the data collected is standardised, and then the averages are reputable for you. If possible, record the route of travel on a map, as seen on the transect slide earlier, to enable annual surveys, let it to be repeatable. And remember that trees might not always be present, so that is the point I forgot to mention earlier. Obviously, if your woodland's going through thinning interventions over several years, or even clear fell if you're on that kind of system, then sometimes your trees might not be there, and especially if you've got higher damaged trees, they might be targeted in a selective thinning approach. So that could also reduce your historic damage over time. I forgot to mention that earlier, so I just thought I'd squeeze that at the end. But I have to take questions alongside screen. Stop sharing.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
It's so valuable to have that fairly, simple and replicatable methodology that people can go out into their woods and yes, please, we're kind of looking for your kind of fresh damage and cumulative damage scores for the tree damage survey, but it's really helpful for you to feed into your management plans and monitor that change over time and change management if you need. Excellent. So we have a few minutes for questions. I know there's quite a few for Alex because it's quite a new subject. Alex, there are quite a few questions around kind of how the volatile compounds impact grey squirrels and their native range, and whether the trees, do they have the volatile compounds that are deterring those trees, or is it to do with the genomics of those trees that they don't get damaged so much, and then in their native range?
Yeah, so we don't really know that much about what kind of volatiles trees are producing generally. I mean, there are like handful of studies that have looked at volatile compositions from trees, but a lot of the time they're very specific to like a specific problem, like
Mm.
mine. But yeah, a lot of the tree species I think that squirrels damage, it's really hard to find a lot of that information because it's just not been done. So yeah, we don't really know what's going on. I mean, I suspect that they're using these compounds to know whether or not a tree is palatable, but we just don't have the information for other species yet to know whether or not that's what they're doing in the States too.
Yeah. And there's a question around the volatile compound blends. Are they tree species specific, or is it that those volatile compound blends found in the poplar cones that influence squirrel behavior could work to protect oak trees? Or blends likely indicating to the squirrel that this isn't this isn't a horrible tasting poplar tree, or a horrible tasting poplar tree in general.
Yeah, I think that they probably are tree species specific, some of them. We would need to do quite a bigger study to know if what we found in our trees is also happening or true of other tree species. But also, I think that that they associate the smell with the taste. So
Mm,
you kind of need the taste there in the tree so that they can learn to associate the smell with the taste. And if you don't have the taste, they'll probably quickly learn that it's fine to eat. Because they still squirrels do a lot of like trial patches,
yeah.
like Ed showed, on trees, and I think that is them tasting the tree. And if it does taste bad, I think they learn to associate that particular taste with a particular smell.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, I think we need both, which is actually what we're looking at in our new project is compounds within the bark, and in particular the resistant tree that we've got in our plot. Um, we think that there's some kind of anti-feedant within the bark that they're associating the smell with. So hopefully we get that information too.
So it's not actually just the smell that they don't like, it's the resulting feeding
Yeah,
aspect.
I think it's probably a combination of
Mm,
both, and they both have to be present.
interesting. Um, we had thought that maybe the attractive volatile compounds could act as lures for traps to improve capture rates for current management programs, grey squirrel management programs.
Yes, I think we definitely could be potentially using some of the attractive compounds in that way. We'd have to test them to see if they actually worked
Yeah,
and made capture rates more effective. But yeah, I think that we could definitely try that.
yeah. No, that sounds really interesting. I know you've answered quite a few questions I've gone last night. Um, does somebody say, does tricho help to repel squirrels as well as deer?
Um, I don't know. That's a really good question. I know that deer have a thing with sheep and wool, um, which is what tricho's made out of. But I don't know if it repels squirrels too. That's a good question.
Yeah, yeah. And then a question, which trees are more susceptible to squirrel damage? And you'll probably both be able to answer this question because I know there's a lot of damage in the national forest.
I'll let Ed answer this one.
Yeah, I mean, broadleafs, obviously more than conifer. You do see it on things like larch, but yeah. So you'll typically see it start on willow and field maple and birch, and then sort of. I'm talking from a very sort of plantation point of view, but even on natural regen again, sycamore, birch, willow to start with. Oak will then sort of oak and beech and hornbeam will then be damaged later on once they've reached a bit more of a because they're just slower growing, the vigor's slower. Yeah, so it tends to be a bit of a sliding scale. And obviously, if you can identify it when it's damaging your willow and your field maple and your silver birch, then that's better than if they've really got into your oak and other
Yeah.
longer term canopy trees that you might want to keep.
So if you've got a new kind of woodland creation site, those faster growing species will get damaged first, probably,
Yeah, bit
and
of an
then
early.
you'll know there's a serious issue that you need to
Yeah,
deal with.
yeah, they can be a bit of an early warning system for landowners, which we don't want them to be, but
No.
can be useful as well. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and then I think in 2024, I was in Wales at a meeting, and a gentleman was saying that they'd moved out of his broadleaf trees because it was a really bad year for damage, anecdotally,
Yeah,
and they'd moved into his Norway spruce, which his Sitka hadn't been damaged, but his Norway
yeah,
spruce has, which was,
yeah,
adds an extra element of concern, doesn't it?
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But 2024 was terrible. So that's a lot of it's driven a lot of people hopefully to take notice, but hopefully we don't get another year like that soon.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons we started the tree damage surveys is that we saw we had that anecdotal evidence, but we didn't have the kind of full evidence. And so we started in 2025, and then last year was a mast year, which is what 2024 kind of was, wasn't it? That was the issue with 2024. It was on the back of a mast year and two mild winters. And so whether we'll see the same increase in damage over the next year, 2 years, we'll have to wait and see, I guess.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, thank you so very much, both of you, for your time. It's been excellent to hear about both the methodology and the interesting what you're doing, Alex. And I hope you continue to bring us more interesting insights into why grey squirrels are doing this and answer some of those questions. So I just want to put another plea out to please get involved with our tree damage survey this year. As Ed said, it's gone through the methodology. It is a fairly easy way to do it, but if you have any questions, please email info@squirrelaccord.uk and either I will try and answer them or I'll pass you on to Ed. A recording of this webinar will be made available on our YouTube channel to rewatch and share at a later date. But thank you so much to Ash and Ed and to all you all for joining us. But goodbye for now and happy National Plant Health Week. Bye.
Thanks, bye.
Hi.